So in our previous video, we discovered a problem. And what was the problem? The problem is that, so whenever we run our code, again, we expect to have a new entry inside of our database. But unfortunately, that's not the case, right? So now we have one entry, right? So if we do Python 3 run again, it overwrites the previous data inside of our database, which makes no sense because you don't want to do this in your database, that every time a new user creates creates an account with your application, his data overwrites the previous data in your database. That means you will lose every other customers or every other users in your database, and that is not what you want to get in your what you want to implement in your application, right? So, and we are trying to find a way to solve this problem so that whenever a new user creates an account with us, his or her data gets appended in the previous data that was in our database, right? And I remember vividly, I told you to try it before we start this video. Did you? I want to believe that you did. So congratulations. So now, before we talk about it, or before we start writing code, let me explain to you what is actually happening behind the scenes so that you kind of get a clue of what we are about to do, right? So every single thing is coming from this save method over here, right? And now, I want you to understand how functions work. So whenever we create a new function, the function gets a memory allocation in our memory, in our computer memory, right? So we get like something like this, right? So when the control starts, basically from the top, right, it just keeps going like this. And here it's a class, obviously, so it has to look for the call. So it comes over here, and here we call the class over here, we instantiated the class over here, right? So he instantiates this person with person 1, and it brings the person 1 to the standard output, and it calls the person 1 dot save. Makes sense, right? And now it moves over to the save method. It pauses, right? And it moves over to the save method. And over the save method, it has a dictionary which is absolutely empty at this instance. And it tries to do what? To populate the dictionary with what? With the value of what? Of the object. So which is, we had a key that we constructed over here. And this constructed key gets inside of our dictionary, and it takes the object and converts it into a dictionary representation and appends it in our big dictionary. Makes a lot of sense. And now it basically uses this code over here to dump it into our file storage. And that's where we got this data in our file storage, right? And now here is the problem. When we run our code again, knowing how function work, what will happen? What happens is that whenever we run a code, the function gets what? Gets a memory allocation inside of our memory. And let's say, for instance, this is our memory, right? So you can see, can you see? So we have memory, and we'll have the save method. So whenever the person 1 calls what? Calls the save method. The save method gets a memory allocation inside of our memory. Look at it over here. So if it gets a memory allocation, it populates what? It populates this object or this dictionary with what? With the data required, which is the object of what? Of the class. And when the code is done running, it takes off, or it rips off this save method out of what? Of our memory. Can you see? It rips it off. So that means that every single data or every single attribute or every single thing happening inside of this save method, it's out of the memory. And what does that entail? What it entails is that this serialized OBJ that had a value when the code was executing will be gone out of the memory. So whenever we run our application again, the serialized OBJ over here starts afresh or comes into the play as an empty dictionary again. So if it comes into play as an empty dictionary again, what happens? It takes what? It takes the object again and populates inside of the serialized OBJ, and which means is what? It's a new entry. Nothing is inside of the serialized OBJ at this point, because what it had before is now out of the memory. So if that is the case, that means it now has a new entry again, and having a new entry, what will happen? It basically does what? It basically uses it with open and dump it again inside of the file storage. And when dumping it in the file storage, remember the file storage, you're making use of write, which is W. And write what? Overwrites what? The previous data in our database. You cannot understand the logic, right? So know that every single run, the serialized OBJ is an empty dictionary at every single run. So if we want to fix the problem, how can we do that? So you can start thinking about it as, we need to do what? We need to find a way to get hold of the previous data that was inside of this serialized OBJ before it gets out of the memory scope. Is it making sense? So we need to get a way to save the data that he had before, which is what the object that was created and populated instead of what? Instead of serialized OBJ before it gets out of the memory. So if we get hold of it, we can kind of keep it. And at every other run, we can kind of get the data, put it back into the serialized OBJ, append the newly created object beneath it and do what? And persist it inside of our dictionary, inside of our file storage. So that we don't lose the previous data. You understand now, right? I think you kind of catch the drill. So we need to get hold of the previous data and make sure it's not out of the memory scope, save it somewhere, and what? And append the newly created object inside of it and what? And persist it. And let me show you what I mean by that. So for instance, this is our what? Our file storage, and we have an entry that ends at F6. And if we're gonna run our application again, we get 7E, and the 7E does what? Obviously, it overwrote what is inside of here, right? So what we can do is let's get hold of this, which is 7E, and come to our main.py and maybe open this serialized OBJ and put it inside of here, right? Let's indent and let's run this code again. Do you think that the data that is inside of here will be overwritten with the newly created data? Let's see. Let's run our code again. Perfect. We have a newly created data which is 3F. And let's come over here. Exactly. What happened? What happened is that when we run our code again, our code started what? Started running, and it came to this serialized OBJ and he saw that, oh, this serialized OBJ has an entry inside of it, and it creates a new, what's it called? A new object, and converted it to a dictionary representation, and seeing that the serialized OBJ already has an entry, and he checked the key. Know that every single key in the dictionary has to be unique. And he checked the key, and the keys are different. So if the keys are different, that means it's a new entry. What will it do? It will automatically append it below the newly created word, below the data that the serialized OBJ had previously, and basically dump it inside of what? Inside of this file storage. And that's technically how it works. But now the problem is that you can't keep coming to your database to do what? To grab the data and come inside of your file storage and kind of add a comma and paste back the data again. Let's just leave it like this and run and see. If we run again and go back to our file storage and check, and yes, it's appended the newly created data. But you can't keep doing this. How? How can you even do this in a real world application? So that means we need to what? We need to find a way around it. So that is what? That is the problem. We need to find a way around it. We need to write some logic to do that for us. We need to what? Write some logic. Let's run our code again. So out. So we need to what? We need to write some logic. And with the whole explanation I gave now, you can kind of, try it out. Maybe pause the video and try it out, right? So how can we do this? So that is what I told you in the last video that we're going to be doing. We're going to be doing reloading. So what we can kind of do is we're going to write another method that reads from this file storage. So if you read from the file storage, it gets this whole data from the file storage again and kind of keep it. And assigns it back to this serialized OBJ, which is this dictionary, and kind of keep it inside of here at every single run. So it reads from the database, gets the data, put it back into the serialized OBJ, and do what? And tell the serialized object and call the serve method again, and serve method runs again. Seeing that it has the data, it just appends. So what we can do is read, append back, and push. Simple. So what can we do? We could basically do what? We could basically go ahead and create a reload method. So the reload method just basically helps us to do a reload from our database. So we could say reload and pass the self keyword over here. For now, let's do pass. Makes sense, right? So we have, okay. For now, let's do pass, right? So now what can we do now after calling this reload method? So we are trying to reload from the database and populate back the serialized object with the previous data. So that means we cannot just call the serialized object over here and pass it here. It will not make sense because they will have the same key, right? So we need to get the previous data and populate it back into the serialized object so that it will be a different key from the newly created object whenever we run our application again. Makes sense, right? So we could just basically come over here and grab this with open and paste it in here. So let me scroll this a little bit and scroll paste it here. So what we can now do now is we don't have to dump, either we have to load. So if you want to load from your database using JSON, you have to call the load method. And what are we loading? We are loading the file, right? So that's it. So just basically have to assign it to where? To content. So just to a variable, and let's print content. So that's it. So let's just comment this out and call our person1 dot reload and see the output. Makes sense. So we just reloaded and we are printing the content of the reload. Let's just first what we have. Right? So now let's print. It says fp dot operation invalid. So what is my problem? Oh, sorry, I meant to use read and not write. Makes sense, right? So we changed the W to R because we wanted to read and we're not writing. Makes sense, right? So we clear this and everything being equal, we run again. And perfect. We have our output, which is basically what we reloaded from our database. And look at it, we have E1. And E1 was what was inside of this database before. So look at it. Can you see? E1. So this is the current data in the database. So we need to get this current data that is in the database and kind of populate it back to what? Populate it back to the serialized object, which is the serialized OBJ. So that when we run our application again, it just does what? It just kind of appends the newly created object into the serialized OBJ instead of overwriting it in our database. Right? So that means at every run, our serialized object is going to have a value inside of it and not an empty dictionary. Is it making sense? So you know what we can do? Let's add a print statement over here and say print serialized object. So you know that it's an empty dictionary at every run. So let's kind of call, let's add on maybe a little write up and say serialized OBJ. So you see, it's an empty dictionary right now. Makes sense, right? So now what we can do is we have to what? Basically populate it with the value coming from here. So for us to do that, we have the value obviously in this content already. So this content now is a dictionary, right? So we can just iterate inside of it and say for K and V in content dot items so that we can get what? The key and value, right? And you know what we can do? Let's just basically print the key and the value, and let's just say key is what? K, and print V is what? Value. I think I called it V. So yes, so first of all, let's just visualize, right? And let's see what we'll get. So we'll say this. And can you see? Key is this key, this person key, and the value is what? The whole what? Dictionary, which is the whole object. So if that is true, that means I can basically just come over here and get what? And get the serialized OBJ and assign back this key inside of it and the whole value back to it again. Is it making sense? So now the serialized OBJ is within a scope. What scope? The save method scope. And we can't access it. Let's record the save method, and which is not what we want to do, right? So what can we do to fix that issue? So what we could basically do is we could try to be smart in here and just basically take this serialized OBJ and make it a class attribute. If you want to be precise, make it a public class attribute, right? And we just have to access it in here and add a self.serialize and add a self.serialize and also self.serialize for us to what? To access the serialized object. And now you could just come over here and do self.serialize OBJ at index key. Remember, that's what we did over here. We opened this square brace and what? And added the key. And this key is this newly created key. But now the K is also the created key. Makes sense, right? So what we can do is just pass the K over here and assign back the V. What is the V? The V is the entire dictionary. The V is this entire dictionary, right? We can just basically what? Assign it back to the serialized OBJ. And that's it. That's just basically what we have to do. Makes sense, right? So what does that entail? What entails is that at every single run, this serialized obj will have the value that was inside of this our database stored inside of the serialized obj. So that means that serialized obj is going to have a value beforehand. So when it does when it tries to assign a new value inside of the save method, it checks the serialized obj, but the serialized obj is no longer empty. It has a value, it has an entry. What can it now do? It can now basically do append the newly created data beneath the serialized obj data. Is it making sense? I really need to understand this. So that's it. So what can we now do? We could basically run our code, and if we run our code right now, we expect to we expect to see a double entry in our database because of the logic that we have designed over here, and that's perfect. So let's see. And the serialized obj is still empty. So if we check our file.json, hold on, we have one entry. Why? But I thought we've actually opened this and we assigned this back, and we've called the reload method, and we expect. So if we check, we have db, and we also have the key over here is 3a, which means it has the previous data, right? So if we check percent key over here, it ended at db. And let's run our code again. If we run our code again, and come on, nothing is in here. And it just overwrote the 2.4. You know what we can do? Let's uncomment this key. Let's uncomment the key out so that you can actually visualize what is going on here. So let's run our code again. So can you see the key? The key is F1. So the key is F1. So that means it has It has this key and value inside of inside of this reload dictionary, instead of this reload method. We expect that at the next run, it should be populated in the serialized obj. And so that when we run our code again, we should see double entry and not one entry. But that is not working. And why is that so? It is so because we just have to change the line of code, just one single line of code, and we are perfect. Trust me. So what is happening in here? It's very straightforward and simple. What is happening in here is that when we run our code, the save method gets called immediately, and it just saves in here, and we call the reload method after the save method, and it just does what? It just gets the previous data and hold. But what do we want to do? We want to actually be able to get the previous data first of all and save it inside of the serialized obj, which is a big dictionary, before we call the save method. I don't know if you understand. We need to get the previous data first off before we call the save method. So how can we do that? Very simple. We can just basically change this reload from here to here. So we are saying before we call the save method, hey brother, the reload method, rush and go and get the data inside of the database and do what? And quickly append it inside of the serialized obj. So the serialized obj can kind of have a value before we do what? Before we call the save method. So that when the save method tries to populate the serialized obj, it sees that what? The serialized obj already has a value. And it checks the key are different, which means it's a new entry. It says, okay, the serialized obj already has what? Already has an entry inside of it. So what can I do? Since the two keys are different, I can basically do what? Append beneath it. And when it appends beneath it, it calls what? It calls the write. And the write does what? Writes into the file storage those two entries. So note that it's what? It's writing back every single time we run our application again. It's writing back the whole data that it reloaded. So it's not writing a single value. It's writing back the whole data that we reloaded and inserted inside of serialized obj. So if we have one entry like this and it reloads it back to this serialized obj, at that instance, that serialized obj has what? One entry. And when we call the serialized obj again over here, the serialized obj now has what? Double entry. So those two double entry is what will be what? Loaded back into the dictionary again. You understand the drill now, right? Okay. So if that is accurate, let's try to run our code again. And perfect. So if we go to our file.json, the moment of truth, the moment I've highly anticipated for. And let's see. My eyes are closed. Did it work? Did it work? Yes! It did! Finally, it did! We now have a double entry in our database. How interesting that could be. How interesting that could be. We now have a double entry. And you can see that's what the simple logic over here. So quickly rush, grab the data, populate it inside of the deserialized obj before we call the save method. Simple. And now, if you're observant enough, you will notice that the serialized obj is no longer empty. Can you see? It's no longer empty. So if we run our code again, watch what will happen. Can you see? The serialized obj now has what? Now has all the whole entry that was in our database before the new object was created. And this is F1, this is 7b. And if we go over here, you could see this is F1. Let me look for the second one. And this is 7b. It does not have the entry of this. 5.9, if we run our code again, 5.9 will get appended. And look at it, we have 5.9 in here. We don't have the newly created data, which is E8. So that's the whole logic behind what? Behind reloading first and what? Pushing it to the serialized obj so that it has a value. So that when we now get to the save method that has to append the value to the serialized obj is no longer empty. It has an entry. It checks the key. The keys are different, meaning it's a new entry. It just basically does what? It just basically appends it to the what? To the serialized obj. Sounds very, very interesting. So this is actually how we are able to come up with a database like this. Even with using the write, which is meant to overwrite every single data in our database at every single run. This seems very, very interesting to know how this logic was built. It makes sense, right? So now we are done. From reloading our data. And now every single data we run, regardless of any amount of time we run it, it just keeps appending. Look at it. It just keeps appending. It will not overwrite. Look at it. You see? It just keeps appending. And I really, really need you to understand how it works. And I hope it is clear. So that's it for For serializing and deserializing. It gets way more than this. And when we start writing the actual code, which is where we start creating the base model. This is kind of a rough work. I really want you to see how every single component works. So when we get into writing the base model, the engine, and the console, you don't get confused what is actually happening in there. So I think this is pretty clear and very, very solid. And I kind of thought, touched a lot of concept from the deserializing, from converting to dictionary, to string, to JSON format, and every single thing, to save, to constructing the key, to constructing a dictionary, to reloading from our database, and a lot of concept was taught in this introductory part of our Airbnb Clone Console. Makes sense, right? And that is it. But know that we can still face varieties of issue with this kind of approach. What is the issue? We can actually face an issue. What is the issue? Let's say, for instance, our database is empty at first run. What do you think will happen? Think. Pause the video and think. At first run, we're going to encounter what? A problem. What is the problem? This reload method gets called immediately and it tries to read from the database. And when trying to read from the database, it tries to read and what? And reload. Look at, we are trying to read from here. So if we read, it's an empty database. So it's going to raise an error saying that there is no data inside of the database. And let's try to run again. Yeah, an error, decoder error. Saying what? It tried to decode a JSON format in our database, but it's not finding any JSON format in your database. So it raised an error immediately. So how can we fix that error? So what we can basically do, we can say, you know what? Before you actually load any data from the database, let's ensure that the database has a data inside of it. Let's ensure that. So what we can basically do is we can import OS and we can come over here and say, so how can we do that? We can say OS, we can say if OS dot path dot get size. We have to pass the path or the file that I want to get the size. So file dot JSON actually exists and is greater than 0. So we are saying if the content inside of the file is greater than 0, that is the only time we want it to what? What is it called? To reload or to do a reload. Makes sense, right? So now if we run our code again and we go over here, empty right now, makes sense. And if we run our code again, we should not have an error. Perfect. So at this first run, this deserialized obj is actually empty, nothing inside of there. But if we check our obj, our file.json now, we will have an entry. And let's check. You see, we have an entry. But a lot of errors can come in. A lot. I need you to use your hand and find out how to make sure you capture all of those single errors. Another error that can come in is, for instance, we have something that is not a JSON format. And you know that having something that is not a JSON format, JSON decoder, we try to decode it, but it will raise an exception again. Exception. Because it's not a JSON format, it has something that is not a JSON format. And how can you do this? Basically simple. You can come over here and do, I needed you to try this. Why am I showing you? My fault. You can just use a try method and say try to decode this label, but if you're unable to decode it, that means there's an error. You can just basically accept, and this is called a JSON.decoder error, right? And you could just do JSON accept JSON.decoder error, and you could basically print and say what? And say, what can I write now? I can basically say unable to decode file storage. Help me out, I don't know what to write, but I think this is fair. So what we are basically doing, we are saying if it actually exists, try to decode what is inside of it. This is a try and accept block, right? So if when you're trying to decode it and if any error should occur, just basically print this out of the standard output instead of what? All these exceptions being raised. And let's see. Fine. It just says what? Unable to decode file storage. Instead of that. So you know that it's unable to decode it. And what will happen? It will what? It will overwrite it because it will actually say we should overwrite. And this doesn't make any sense because if somebody has a file that's just seen already file JSON already exists in that person's computer, it will overwrite it definitely, and that's not what you want to do. But I'm trying to show you that a lot of issues can actually what? Occur. You can basically tell the person to maybe change the name from file.json to another thing, just just so that a lot of issues can occur. So you need to be what? In the shoes of the user and basically test every single possible issue that can occur. That is why we'll be doing what? Unit testing, because we'll be putting ourselves in the shoes of the user and test every single possible case of error that can occur when we are trying to work in our application. And that's it. That's the end of this video. You were able to understand how we are going to serialize and deserialize, load the data and reload the data back to our application and work with the data. So this is just like a tip of the iceberg. In the next video, in the coming videos, we're going to start working on our application properly, from creating the base model to creating a file storage to also creating our console, and finally to working restructuring our project and also working on unit testing, which is, I think, the most crucial part of this video, because without a unit test, I don't think there is anybody that can boost a very robust application. So we'll also be creating some basic unit testing for our application to ensure the robustness of our application and ensure that our application is in order. So thank you so much for staying back to watch this beautiful series, and I will catch you in the next video. Remember to share, subscribe, like, and do everything possible to support the channel. Thank you so much, and God bless you.